Yokoso. Say after me, Yokoso. Again, Yokoso. Oh, you're much better than 5 days ago. Very good. Great. So yes. So welcome to you all to the second presidential plenary. It is, by the way, being streamed, and but not only is it being streamed live, it is also this and the previous plenary and the opening ceremony are available on the ISA website if you hit World Congress, so you can see them to your heart's content. I have one announcement, and that is the party tonight. The party tonight from 9 to 11 at Osambashi Pier. It is a beautiful hall that overlooks the bay. There will be music, I believe jazz, and there will also be food. So I hope to see many of you there tonight. In fact, I hope to see all of you there tonight. Anyway, it is a beautiful place. So I am your president for another hour and a half. And at the end of this panel, there will be a very special ceremony in which I will hand over my enormous power to my successor, Professor Margaret Abraham. So that is something, a treat in store. So today we are indeed having the second plenary entitled Alternatives to an Unequal World. We have been waiting for this plenary. We want to know indeed what alternatives there could possibly be. So in choosing people for these plenaries, I have made an effort to bring to you people, young and old, people whose faces have not been regularly appearing in ISA programs. And today is no exception. But before I introduce them, let me say that we have indeed been talking here for a week about inequality, facing an unequal world. And even as we speak, during these 5 or 6 days, the world out there has actually experienced all sorts of unpleasant things that sort of are an expression of the sorts of issues we've been talking about. I need only mention, for example, the Israeli bombing in Gaza and I haven't been following the news all day, but the seemingly shooting down of a Malaysia airline over Ukraine. So what we are talking about here has, in fact, direct implications for the way we understand the world beyond. And the panelists today are people who are very conscious of the world beyond. It is a strong panel of people who have global sociology in their bones. No, in their DNA. They live global sociology. The first speaker tonight, and I should say we only have 3. I am sorry to tell you that Elizabeth Yellen has told me that she's not able to come. But anyway, we do have 3 panelists here today. Erik Olin WRIGHT is the first. Perhaps some of you know him best as a theorist of class inequality, very relevant to the issues of this Congress, but actually has spent the last 20 years of his life devoted to what he calls real utopias, insisting on the moral foundations of sociology. And it's the second issue around real utopias that he will be talking today. The second 2 speakers will actually be talking about how you might conceivably realize real utopias. And we are going to discover, I think, that to realize an alternative to unequal world involves quite a strenuous and dedicated engagement in science as well as in politics. Punai, who will go second, is the author of a magnificent ethnography, Made in China, a study of Chinese women workers, came out in 2005, and she has since then been following the implications of her study, developing the connection, you might say, between theory and practice in the confronting, most recently, one of the largest employers in the world, an enterprise, a Taiwanese enterprise called Foxconn. That is Punai, and we will end with Walden Bello, whose CV, whose life trajectory is an extraordinary interlacing of science and political engagement. Conducted research in many places in the world, beginning with his dissertation, which was a study of Chile and the class basis of the Chilean coup, who led Food First, an international agency, actually it's centered in Oakland, California, involved in writing all sorts of very important books about the Marcos regime, some of which required him to break into the World Bank in the search of truth. Yes, breaking into the World Bank in search of truth. Yes, some people think that's not the way to get truth. But sometimes, to get truth, you have to break the law. Anyway, don't worry. He's now a free man. Yes. Anyway, so he has since then daringly entered Philippine politics, but he still continues to write academic and non-academic books, and his last book came out last year. It's called Capitalism's Last Stand, Deglobalization in the Age of Austerity. So we will begin. We begin with Erik Olin WRIGHT.
Let's see, how do I get my PowerPoint to work? Here we go. In March of this year, I was invited to Taiwan to speak at Academica Sinica, and it turned out, although my trip had been planned for a year and a half, that I arrived in the middle of the sunflower protests, in which, among other things, a group of a couple of hundred students occupied the National Legislative Chamber. Naturally, once I realized that it was possible for me to get into the chamber, arrangements were made. I asked if I could. And on the second of the two visits, I held a seminar of sorts with a group of Taiwanese students who had been in this building by that point about 10 days. They were tired, exhausted. They had been sleeping on the floor in the legislative chamber. Just imagine in the United States the House of Representatives being occupied by students. The doors to the chamber were barricaded. Only one was left open for entry and exit. The protests were about the free trade pact with China. Their ability to occupy the building had to do with internal faction fights within the government, which gave them a certain space to maneuver. That's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the conversation I had with these students. This image, as you can imagine, is, for me personally, one of the most poignant photos ever taken of me, surrounded by young people wearing the kind of informal uniform of the protest, black T-shirts with slogans. I happen to be wearing this bright blue shirt. It makes for a nice aesthetic combination. My white hair. But what was really powerful was the level of connection that we had, the intensity of the meeting of minds. They asked me questions. I talked about the protests in Wisconsin of 3 years earlier. We talked about the sociology of protests. I talked a little about real utopias. And then at one point, one of the students asked me the following question. What's the point of what we're doing if we lose? What's the point? Mostly the people, at least that I was talking to, were fairly inexperienced politically. These weren't hardened protesters. For most of them, this was their first major kind of political engagement. And they asked what the point would be if they lose. And here's what I said sort of spontaneously on the spot. I suggested that there's two sorts of ways you can think about a protest of this sort. One is in a narrowly instrumental framework. You're engaged in protest to win certain demands. If you don't win the demands, you've lost. A kind of simple instrumental view. Another view is that protests are episodes in a long history of episodes which have a past, the episodes that bring you to the present, and which extend in some indeterminate way into the future. Whether or not those episodes constitute a trajectory towards some destination is something that's up for grabs. But if you see an individual protest as an episode in a sequence of episodes, then you're forced to ask the question, what destination are you hoping for? And I asked them that question. What are your ideals? What kind of Taiwan do you want to live in 10 years from now, 30 years from now? What is your vision for the alternative world which you are trying to forge? And what became clear to them, and certainly to me in the course of the conversation, is they were much clearer about what they opposed than what they were for. They had really clear ideas about why they opposed the free trade pact with China. They did not really have a well-articulated vision of what kind of world they wanted to create. Well, figuring out what kind of world you want to create and figuring out how to link your present practices not merely to opposing the damages of the present world, but to bringing forth the alternative, which is part of your imagination. That's what the idea of real utopias is supposed to facilitate. Real utopias is a particular way of thinking about alternatives. The utopia part of the couplet instructs us to look for alternatives to dominant institutions that embody our deepest aspirations for a just and humane world. The real in real utopias says we should look for alternatives that can be built in the world as it is, that also prefigure the world as it could be, and which move us in that direction. Now, to elaborate this idea in any depth, I think, means to embed it in a broader agenda that I like to call emancipatory social science. Emancipatory social science has four basic tasks. The first is elaborating the moral foundations of the ideals which we seek. In my own work, I've stressed four, or I'm now stressing four moral foundations: equality, democracy, community, and sustainability. I won't discuss those in this presentation because of time constraints. The second task is the diagnosis and critique of the present world in light of those moral foundations. How well do our institutions live up to those ideals? And what are the specific causal processes that explain the gaps, the deficits? Diagnosis and critique has been the main preoccupation of critical sociologists of whatever stripe. The third task is the elaboration of alternatives. Given the moral foundations and the deficits in the world as it is, what alternative world would in fact make things better? And the fourth task is an account of transformation. How do you get from here to there? What I want to do in my limited time here is focus mainly on alternatives and close with a few words about transformations. And I'm only going to focus on a kind of subset of the full problem of alternatives, the subset that goes under the heading of real utopias. So now into some empirical cases. Here's a long list. This is a kind of laundry list of real utopias. These are all examples of social changes, initiatives, alternative forms that exist in the world as it is, that prefigure the world as it might be, and which, to at least a limited extent, may help us move in that direction. Let me just, in a punchy way, talk about a few of these. First, worker cooperatives. Worker cooperatives are probably the best known real utopian alternative to capitalist institutions. They are firms that are democratically run and owned by their employees. They're not a complete transformation of capitalist relations. They still operate within markets, but they advance at least two of the values that I listed before: democracy, equality, community, and sustainability. They are more egalitarian. They embody democratic principles. They probably enhance community in the sense of social solidarities. They may or may not address issues of sustainability. One of my favorite examples of a cooperative is in Madison, Wisconsin, where I live. It's a coffee roasting cooperative called Just Coffee. The name is a pun, of course, on justice and only coffee. What's distinctive about Just Coffee is not merely that as a coffee roaster they are cooperatively owned and run by by the members of the cooperative, but they see their task as establishing direct relations with grower cooperatives in the global south. This is one of their coffee bags, and it shows the coffee commodity chain that Just Coffee helps to organize compared to the conventional commodity chain. And on the back, they show how much of the cost of the coffee goes to each contributor to the final product. Their goal, what they would like to see, is a kind of global cooperative of cooperatives so that the entire value chain, all of the value added in the course of the production and distribution of coffee, can be fairly distributed across each of the steps. To do that, they establish these strong relationships with grower cooperatives and sometimes bring them to Madison to train them in coffee roasting and coffee brewing so that they can earn revenues not merely from the export of coffee, but in their local settings, the roasting and brewing of coffee as well. So you don't think that cooperatives are only for specialty niches or relatively simple commodities like coffee. Also in Madison, there's a robotics manufacturing company called Isthmus Engineering that makes high-end industrial robots, which is also a worker-owned cooperative, in which the machinists and the receptionists and the engineers are all one person, one vote members of the cooperative firm. And this firm regularly outcompetes its capitalist rivals. Well, I don't want to play the fantasy game, the kind of cheerful cheerleader, to imagine that, you know, if there was only a will, there'd be a way and cooperatives could displace capitalist firms. That was Proudhon's fantasy. No, there are many obstacles to why cooperatives, which explain why cooperatives occupy relatively small niches. And that's one of the tasks of sociologists, to figure out where the constraints are and what enabling conditions could be created that would expand the scope and possibility for the proliferation of this particular real utopia, democratically organized and run firms, albeit within a capitalist economy, but which, if they became more dynamic and expansive, could contribute to the erosion of the dominance of capitalism. Next example, peer-to-peer collaborative production. The most famous instance of this, of course, is Wikipedia. Wikipedia is simply impossible. We know it doesn't exist. You can't possibly get several 100,000 people to cooperate globally without pay to produce an encyclopedia with 4 million entries in the English language, which destroys a 300-year-old commercial market in encyclopedias. It's not possible. Well, of course, we know it is possible. Wikipedia is an example of something more broadly that can be called peer-to-peer collaborative production. Linux is another example. Linux is an interesting case. It's an operating system, open source, produced by the contributions of software designers around the world, it's so successful that some large corporations like Google devote their own resources to paying their own software engineers to contribute to the improvement of Linux, even though no intellectual property rights are associated with it. It's free. Anybody can download and use it. And yet, corporations are contributing to it because it's better than what they can produce in a proprietary framework. One interpretation of this is that the commons of Linux is a kind of commons, that we have co-opted corporations to contribute to the commons. Another interpretation is that Google has this fantastic capitalist fantasy of having thousands of software engineers work for nothing to improve software which Google uses, an infinite rate of exploitation. That reflects the contradictory character of real utopias. To be real, they have to exist and be sustainable and reproducible within capitalist society. To be utopian, they have to be subversive of the social relations of capitalism. That's an inherently contradictory process. This is the statistical package R. I won't talk about that because of time constraints, again. Urban agriculture with community land trusts. So urban agriculture with community land trusts is an idea that involves two kind of elements. One is taking land out of the market by restoring it to a kind of commons in the form of a land trust run by a community. In some countries, that's an easy legal form. In others, it's not. In the United States, it turns out there's a relatively straightforward legal form by which common property rights can be reestablished in land, and then devoting it to a variety of purposes. This particular community land trust is in Madison again. It involves urban gardens, an urban farm, and low-cost co-housing in which the price of the housing is well below market price because the land is taken out of the market. This is a community land trust from Detroit. Detroit is an example of a large city whose central city has been destroyed by deindustrialization and other processes, with large tracts of available land. And one of the purposes to which this land can be devoted is agriculture. And then the question is on whose terms. And community land trust provides one mechanism by which that land can be then controlled by the communities and used for productive purposes. On finance. Crowdfunding of projects. Kickstarter must be familiar to many of you. Kickstarter is a way that people can raise money without going to banks or to granting agencies or to foundations by posting on Kickstarter a proposal and acquiring funds. My daughter is a theater director, and her theater company that she works with collaboratively called Applied Mechanics raised money for their new production, which actually I think opens this evening, called We Are Bandits. And they also did it through an Indiegogo campaign similar to Kickstarter. Alternative currencies. Alternative currencies are ways of creating currencies for purposes of exchange outside of the dominant currency system. This is the Hong Kong time-based local currency from the Wan Chai district, which I visited on the same trip that took me to Taiwan. This currency is denominated in minutes. You perform services at a community center. Elderly women doing cooking classes, for example, will be paid in minutes, and then you can use this currency to purchase services, or in a couple of shops, you can use it to purchase material goods. There's one shop that sold produce from farms in which you paid for part of the produce with currency to reimburse the material cost of production, and part of it with alternative currency. Babysitting cooperatives are famously, can be organized with alternative currencies. Baby bucks, they are called in some places. Open source intellectual property rights, well, this is a way of trying to create a commons and then ensure that it doesn't become privatized. The Creative Commons licensing is one of the well-known ways of doing this. There are now experiments in creating open source licensing for seeds, for pharmaceuticals and for other kinds of products of human creativity that it's difficult to put into the commons without it then becoming privatized by corporations. And that's what these new licensing arrangements are trying to accomplish. Free publicly provided goods. Now this is a really old real utopia. Libraries are my favorite example. To each according to need. You go into a library, you check out the books you need. It's a communist institution. The United States happens to have a fantastic public library system founded by Andrew Carnegie. But it's not just libraries. There's a movement in various places for free public transportation. Public transportation ought to be free. There's no economic rationale, even in conventional bourgeois economics, for there to be a charge for public transportation because the positive externalities are so enormous, especially in a world of global warming. Free public transportation has been adopted in some places. In some cities in the Netherlands, there are free public transportation. This is an example of the impact on ridership. I'm told that in this particular town recently, the subventions for the public transportation have disappeared, and so there's a battle on at the moment to restore it. Even in the United States, the Staten Island Ferry, if any of you go to New York, that's free public transportation. This is a list of cities from that website at the beginning in which public transportation is free. Okay, I'm going to have to, well, just do one more and then we'll have to skip to the last part. Unconditional basic income. I've clipped in here from YouTube a video that Guy Standing is involved in about a basic income experiment in India. I would encourage you to watch this. It's extremely interesting. Unconditional basic income provides a guaranteed basic no-frills income for everyone, unconditionally on the performance of good deeds or work contribution. It's an enabling real utopia because not only does it itself directly solve some certain problems, such as poverty, but it enables people to engage in all sorts of other activities. Unconditional basic income is a way of underwriting worker cooperatives, for example. Well, I'm going to have to just skip through these to get to the punchlines. What do all of these have in common? They all embodying varying degrees the values of equality, democracy, community, and sustainability to a greater extent than does capitalism. But what about transformation? Okay, I'll run through this last 2 more minutes. Okay. There are 2 classic visions for challenging capitalism. Taming capitalism and smashing capitalism. Taming capitalism is the social democratic vision. It says capitalism generates harms. We can't get rid of capitalism, but we can neutralize those harms. The analogy I like to use is if you're a young parent with babies that wake up at night and you wake up every day with a headache, you can take aspirin as a way of neutralizing the headache, or you could get rid of the cause, get rid of the baby. Well, most parents opt for taming babyism rather than smashing it. The revolutionary socialist tradition, however, says aspirins just don't work in the long run. The headaches get worse and worse, the aspirin fails. There is no alternative to smashing capitalism. The smashing capitalism idea is an attractive one. I mean, if it would work, it would solve all sorts of problems. The difficulty is that the experience of the 20th century makes it very problematic to imagine that capitalism is the kind of system which is smashable in such a way that what comes in its aftermath is a democratic, egalitarian alternative. We do know that social systems can be smashed. That is, they can be rapidly and rupturally dismantled. The problem is what comes in their aftermath. And so far, we do not have an experience, we don't have evidence that a robust, democratic, egalitarian, community-enhancing and sustainable alternative can be built through a smashing process. So there's a third strategy, eroding capitalism. And that's what the Real Utopias idea is meant to underwrite. Build alternatives in the spaces where it's possible that prefigure the world that you want. Now, this is not just a bottom-up strategy. Many of the examples that I listed involve strong state involvement. The state has to underwrite the building of things into spaces that are possible. But it takes a very long perspective on the possibility of transformation, much more like the way capitalism emerges inside of feudalism than the classical fantasy of how capitalism can be overcome. Well, one final closing question. Could the expansion and deepening of these and other real utopia examples ever cumulatively erode the dominance of capitalism? Are they doomed to remain on the fringes in small niches, leaving capitalist power hegemonic? Well, I can't answer that question. But in lieu of an answer, I would say we cannot know in advance how far we can go in building alternatives within capitalism that push us beyond. Thank you very much.
Very good. So we now have the question: tame capitalism, smash capitalism, or erode capitalism?